It all started long before 1914. Long before the first shot. Europe was not destroyed by accident. A pressure that no one wanted to stop was slowly built up. The nations grew, became stronger, more ambitious. And they began to compete for control of the world. Capitalism demanded expansion. More resources, more markets, more power. Then imperialism appeared. The great powers sat down to divide up the planet. As if it were a board without an owner. But one of them grew faster than the others. Germany. And she was not willing to be left behind. The tensions began to build up. Alliances, rivalries, fear. Europe stopped being a continent. And it became a battlefield in waiting. When the war broke out in 1914, it was not the beginning of the conflict. It was the inevitable consequence of everything that had been built in silence. But what nobody expected, it's that the war would not only destroy countries, it would also destroy entire systems. Revolutions, fall of empires, and new ideologies being born from chaos. The world would never be the same again. Europe had gone decades without a major war. That created a dangerous illusion. The powers were growing, they were expanding. And they accumulated power without confronting directly. It seemed like stability. But in reality it was a fragile balance. Beneath the surface, tensions were rising. The most unstable point was in the Balkans, where two forces constantly collided. Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Every movement in that region brought the conflict a little closer. Meanwhile, Germany was growing rapidly. His rise altered the balance of power in Europe and generated distrust among the other powers. To protect themselves, nations began to form alliances, closed blocs, military commitments, promises of support in case of war. Europe stopped being a set of independent countries, and it went on to operate as a connected system. If one fell, everyone seemed to be dragged along. What were once isolated conflicts? Now they could turn into a total war. The entire continent was getting ready, without knowing it, for an inevitable confrontation. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was already divided into two large blocs. Alliances were formed, but war did not yet seem inevitable. Then a decisive factor appeared. Germany. Its growth was rapid, constant, and greater than that of any other European power. Within a few years, it surpassed its rivals in industry, economy, and military capacity. But that growth brought a problem. Germany did not have enough space, not enough colonies, nor direct access to all the resources it needed. And he decided to change that. His foreign policy ceased to be defensive. She became expansive, ambitious, and unpredictable. Germany began to build a large fleet capable of challenging Britain's naval dominance. He also reinforced his army, preparing for a full-scale conflict. The message was clear. I didn't just want to exist in Europe. I wanted to dominate. This change completely upset the balance. Britain saw a direct threat to its sea power. France interpreted it as a risk to its security. Russia understood it as an obstacle to its expansion. Each power began to prepare. Not to avoid war, but to win it. Europe was no longer a continent in tension. It was a countdown system. At the beginning of the 20th century, the tensions were no longer theoretical. they began to take real shape. France and Great Britain, former rivals. They decided to leave their conflicts behind. They signed an agreement. The Cordial Entente. It was not a direct military alliance. But the balance of power in Europe changed. For the first time, two great powers. They stopped competing with each other. And they began to coordinate. Germany interpreted it as a threat. He tried to break that new balance. And he chose a specific scenario. Morocco. In 1905, Germany intervened, challenging French influence in the region. The objective was clear: weaken the relationship between France and Great Britain. But the opposite happened. France received support. Britain did not back down. And Germany was exposed. The crisis did not end in war. But he left something much more dangerous. Distrust. Accumulated tension. And the certainty that the next conflict, it would not be diplomatic. I would be a soldier. Europe was no longer just divided. Now she was testing herself. Measuring forces. Preparing for what would come next. Europe was no longer just divided. Now it was loaded. Ready to explode. In the heart of the continent, there was an unstable region, the Balkans. A territory where old tensions coexisted. Weakened empires. And peoples who wanted independence. Austria-Hungary was trying to maintain control. Serbia aspired to expand. And Russia watched. Protecting the Slavic peoples, but also defending their own interests. Every movement in the Balkans was not an isolated event. He was a threat to the entire European balance. A spark in a field full of gunpowder. At the same time, the great powers began to prepare. Not with words, with steel. Germany and Great Britain started an unprecedented naval race. Bigger ships. Faster. More destructive. It wasn't defense. It was anticipation. Each nation armed itself. Not in case the war arrived, but because they knew he was going to arrive. Europe stopped being a continent at peace. It became a system under tension. A perfect mechanism. Just waiting for a sign. A shot. A mistake. Or an inevitable destiny. Europe was already prepared. Not for peace, but for war. Only a spark was missing. And she/she arrived in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a young nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. A shot. An instant. But it was not an isolated event. It was the signal that the whole system was waiting for. Austria-Hungary reacted immediately. It accused Serbia, demanded impossible answers, and decided to attack. Then the mechanism was activated. Germany supported Austria. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. France backed Russia. And Germany declared war. The whole of Europe got moving. There was no pause. There was no reflection. Only chain decisions, like tokens falling one after another. In a matter of days, the entire continent was at war. But the war did not start in Sarajevo. Sarajevo was just the trigger. The war had begun long before, in alliances, in ambitions, in fear, and in constant preparation for an inevitable conflict. Europe did not fall into war. Europe already lived within it. And in that summer of 1914, history crossed a point of no return. It all happened in a matter of days. On July 31st, Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia, demanding its immediate demobilization. Russia refused, and then Germany declared war. 2 days later, the conflict spread to France. But the decisive move was another. Germany invaded Belgium, a neutral territory. That act changed everything. Britain couldn't ignore it, and entered the war. In less than a week, all of Europe was engulfed in total conflict. The alliances were activated like an automatic mechanism. Nobody could stop him. Nobody wanted to stop him. And the most surprising thing is that many celebrated it. After decades of tension, the war was greeted with enthusiasm. Crowds filled the streets, flags raised, patriotic speeches. They thought it would be fast. They thought it would be glorious. They believed they would return soon. But they were wrong. Very wrong. What began as a chain of quick decisions would become one of the most devastating conflicts in history. Europe had not only entered war. It had entered a new era. An era of total destruction. And there was no turning back. But the war didn't end as they expected. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. It became slow, heavy, and deeply destructive. The Western Front was caught in a total stalemate. Kilometers of trenches, men buried in mud, and a war where you can advance a few meters. It cost thousands of lives. The offensives were repeated again and again. Verdun, the Somme, names that did not represent victories. But wear, pure wear and tear. The soldiers lived under constant fire, surrounded by death, with no possibility of escape. Technology was advancing, but not to save lives, to destroy them faster. Machine guns, heavy artillery, poisonous gas, and for the first time, the tanks. Machines designed to break the front, but still imperfect, incapable of changing the immediate fate of the war. Meanwhile, in the East, the war was different. More movement, more space, but just as brutal. The Russian Brusilov offensive achieved a devastating blow against Austria-Hungary. They captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. And for a moment, it seemed that the balance could be broken. But it was not enough. Because this war, he no longer depended on a single victory. It was a system of total wear, where I would win. Not the strongest, but the one who resisted the longest. Europe was no longer fighting to advance. She was struggling not to collapse. And every day that passed, the war was becoming longer, more expensive, and more impossible to stop. The war kept advancing, but not towards victory. Towards where? After Verdun, another offensive arrived. The Somme, a battle designed to break the German front. But what happened was something else. The first day, tens of thousands of British soldiers fell. In a matter of hours. The offensive continued for months. Minimal progress, enormous costs, and an increasingly clear reality. There was no quick way to win. The generals insisted. But the war no longer responded to plans. It responded to the where. To the resistance. The ability to endure more losses than the enemy. Meanwhile, the conflict extended beyond the trenches. In the sea, Great Britain dominated. His fleet was blocking Germany, isolating it from trade and weakening its economy. Germany replied with submarines. A new form of war. Invisible, unpredictable, and lethal. On other fronts, the attempts to break the balance also failed. Gallipoli, an ambitious operation to open a route to Russia, ended in disaster. Thousands of dead, and no victory. The war no longer had a clear direction. It was expanding. It consumed resources and exhausted all sides. Europe was trapped in a conflict that no one could win quickly, but that no one could abandon. And the longer it lasted, something became clearer. This was no normal war. It was a total war. And he had not yet shown the worst. The war was not only fought in the trenches. There was also fighting at sea. Britain imposed a total blockade, isolating Germany. No trade, no supplies, no exit. It was a different war. Not against armies, against the economy, and against the civilian population. Germany responded with submarines, invisible attacks, sudden, without notice. The ships were sunk, no matter who traveled in them. Then something happened. The Lusitania, a sunken ocean liner. More than 1,000 dead. Many of them civilians. The reaction was immediate. Public opinion changed. The war was no longer distant. And it was starting to feel real. For a while, Germany stopped its submarine war. But the tension did not disappear. Because the sea, it was no longer a neutral space. It was another front. Another battlefield. Meanwhile, the large fleets sought the decisive confrontation. Jutland, the largest naval clash of the war. Steel against steel. In the middle of the sea. But even there was no clear victory. Just more wear and tear. More uncertainty. More war. Germany failed to break British rule. And Britain could not destroy the German fleet. The balance continued. But something had changed. The war was no longer just European. It was going global. Affecting economies, populations, and decisions around the world. And every movement brought new powers closer to the conflict. Because in a total war, no one remains neutral forever. While the war continued, two events changed everything. First, USA. For years, he had remained neutral, observing, trading, benefiting from the conflict. But that neutrality, it couldn't last forever. German submarine attacks, and the sinking of ships with civilians, they changed public opinion. The war was no longer far away. It was a direct threat. In 1917, the United States made a decision. Enter the war. Not only as support, but as a force capable of tipping the balance. Millions of soldiers, industrial resources, and an intact economy. The balance was beginning to break. But at the same time, at the other end of Europe, the opposite happened. Russia was falling apart. Years of war, hunger, defeats. They had taken the country to the limit. The population rose. The army began to fail. And the system collapsed. In 1917, the Tsar abdicated. The old empire was disappearing. But the chaos didn't end there. Because in the midst of that crisis, a new force appeared. The Bolsheviks. Led by Lenin. They promised something simple and powerful: peace, pan, and land. While others doubted, they acted. And little by little, they took control. Russia was coming out of the war. But it was entering a revolution. A revolution that would change the world. So, in the same year, the war was completely transformed. A giant entered the conflict. And another was collapsing from within. The balance. He was no longer the same. And the end was beginning to take shape. But the story didn't stop there. Because while Russia fell into the hands of the Bolsheviks, they made a decision that would change the war. Get out of the conflict. In 1918, they signed peace with Germany. The Eastern Front was disappearing. And Germany was free. Free to concentrate all his forces on a single objective: the West. It was his last chance. His last attempt at victory. In the spring of 1918, they launched a massive offensive. Quick, violent, decisive. They advanced like never before. Breaking lines, pushing the Allies, getting dangerously close to victory. It seemed that everything could change. But something had changed in the balance. The United States was already in the war. And his troops, they were beginning to arrive. Fresh, numerous, unstoppable. The Allies resisted. And little by little, they began to recover ground. Germany had bet everything. And I was losing. The wear, hunger, the tiredness. They were beginning to break his fighting capacity. And then, the end came. In November 1918, Germany asked for an armistice. The war was over. After years of destruction, millions of dead, and a devastated continent, nothing was ever the same again. Europe was no longer the center of the world. Empires had fallen. And a new era. It had just begun. But peace, it wouldn't be the end. It would just be the beginning of something even greater. The story didn't end there. As Russia fell into the hands of the Bolsheviks, they made a decision that would change the war. Get out of the conflict. In 1918, they signed peace with Germany. The Eastern Front disappeared. And suddenly, Germany was free. Free to concentrate all his power on a single objective: the West. It was his last chance. his last attempt at victory. In the spring of 1918 they launched a massive offensive. Fast, violent, unstoppable. They advanced like never before. They broke lines. They pushed the Allies. For a moment, it seemed like they could win. But the balance had already changed. The United States was at war. And his troops were beginning to arrive. Fresh. Numerous. Decisive. The Allies resisted. And little by little, they began to regain ground. Germany had bet everything. And I was losing. The wear. Hunger. The tiredness. They ended up breaking his resistance. And then, the end came. In November 1918, Germany asked for an armistice. The war was over. Millions of dead. A devastated continent. Nothing was ever the same again. Europe stopped being the center of the world. Empires fell. And a new era began. But peace was not the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger.